3. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is ELINA SYAMIMI binti Hassan.
My name is SITI MARIAM binti Muhammad Ramli.
My name is PHOP SIRIRAKH anak laki PRAVITH.
And my name is Muhammad Syamim AIMAN bin SUKRI.
So we are going to presenting our group, which is group 8 for Rylands and Fletcher. Next.
Okay, for the introduction, Rylands and Fletcher was a decision by the House of Lords, which established a new area of English law. Rylands employs contractors to build a reserve, playing no active role in its construction. When the contractor discovered a series of all goals have improperly filled with debris, they choose to continue work rather than properly blocking them up. Next.
Okay, first of all, I will show a short video about Rylands with Fletcher.
Tort law typically requires a defendant to have acted negligently. Injured plaintiff can recover damages. If a defendant hasn't been negligent, the injured plaintiff usually can't win. But for certain types of danger, the law has developed the principle of strict liability. Under this doctrine, certain harmful acts can merit compensation even if the defendant didn't act negligently. The British case of Rylands versus Fletcher considers one situation in which strict liability applied. In 1860, Rylands owned a mill in Lancaster County, England. They wanted to build a reservoir to supply the mill with running water, so they hired an engineer and other contractors. The engineer then selected the reservoir's location, designed it, and built it. But long before the reservoir went up, the site had been mined for coal. Decades, perhaps centuries earlier, 5 vertical shafts had been dug, then later filled with soil, rocks, and timber. By the time Rylands came along, these ancient shafts were completely hidden and long forgotten. Rylands' engineer discovered the shafts during the reservoir's construction, but didn't warn Rylands about them. They completed the reservoir and began to fill it with water. Fletcher operated coal mines on land adjacent to Rylands' mill and reservoir. Fletcher's mines connected to various underground caves and crevices, and eventually to the ancient shafts now underneath Rylands Reservoir. In December, as the reservoir was being filled, one of the ancient shafts collapsed. Water flooded down and throughout the subterranean structure and into Fletcher's coal mines. Fletcher was forced to suspend mining, and eventually he abandoned his entire mining operation. Fletcher sued Rylands for losses stemming from the mine's closure. A jury trial found for Fletcher. On appeal, the Court of the Exchequer reversed the trial court, ruling Rylands, having no knowledge of the mine shafts or their connection to Fletcher's mines, wasn't negligent. Therefore, Rylands couldn't be held liable for Fletcher's losses. That decision was reversed by the Exchequer Chamber, which ruled that because Rylands collected a dangerous quantity of water in his reservoir, he was liable for Fletcher's damage.
Okay, after we watch the short video, next I want to explain about the factor of the case. Rylands, the defendants had a reservoir built on his property by independent contractor. The contractor were picked on their own and appear to be capable of carrying out the work. During the building of the reservoir, the contractor discovered several Asian coal tunnel and passage beneath the defendant's property. Their passageway was supposed to be connected to a mine on the plaintiff lands, but the contractor discovered that there were a few which lost dead and earth. The contractor ignores them and continue to contract the receiver over the passageway, and the receiver was filled with uh, water. Water when it was finished. Next slide. Okay. On December 1860, shortly after the water was filled in the reservoir, water caused the reservoir to burst and enter the passage beneath the reservoir. Consequently, the water uh, reached the plaintiff lands and burns towards the mine on the lands. The Red House collectively those flooding dams feature tried pumping the water out, but on April, his pump also burns, causing the mines of fought against. Ultimately, and Meng's inspector was called. The coal shaft beneath the defendant's land was discovered. Next.
Okay. This is the requirement in Rylands literature. There is four requirements in Rylands literature, which is first, the defendant brought something onto his land. The second one is non-natural use of the land. The third one is something likely to do mischief. And the last one is he did escape and cause damage. Okay, for the first point is the defendant brought something onto his land, which is mean there is a legal distinction between objects that grow or develop naturally on the soil and those that are made there by the defendant artificially. On land, for example, boulders and thistles are common, and the defendants in Rylands with Fletcher, on the other hand, carried water onto the land. For non-natural use of the land is Lord Keynes in the House of Lords established the requirement of a non-natural use of the property. Okay, for an example, Mason Levy Autopass Ltd on their farm, the DS kept flammable materials. It caught fire and spread to nearby properties, and these were deemed accountable because the material storage constituted an unnatural use of the property. For something likely to do mischief is if the item introduced onto the property escapes, it must be capable of causing havoc. In this case, the defendant keeps it in at his own risk. And last but not least, for the thing that did escape and cause damage, the dangerous substance must be able to get away from the defendant's property. For an example, Lyons, we read that he was employed at a munitions plant, and she was hurt when there was an explosion. There was no indication that the employers were negligent, and because the explosion happened on this property, there was no escape and so no culpability in violence with Fletcher.
Syamim,
Okay, for the next slide. Yeah.
your camera is not on.
Okay, dah on dah.
Okay, bawah je. Tadi tak ada.
Jangan nak campur ya.
Okay, continue.
Okay. Orang lain nampak kamera ke?
Okay, dapat.
Yang kali PM. Okay, continue with the next slide. Okay, here is some of the rules in violence with Fletcher. Okay. According to Blackburn Jade, the rule in violence with Fletcher is unmistakably an example of strict liability. He claims that anyone who comes on his land for personal gain and collects and keeps everything liable to cause mischief if it escapes must keep it in at his peril. Okay, absolutely liability is not the same as strict liability. Initially, it was assumed that the rule applied to gathering and storing dangerous items, or some items that, while not inherently dangerous, are regarded dangerous in the context of mankind's time and location. The rules appears to be particularly beneficial in environmental circumstances when damage is caused by dangerous substances escaping. However, further additions to the regulation have drastically limited the rule's applicability. On top of that, a new meaning has been given to the term. It refers to a land use that is uncommon, outstanding, or bizarre. In a read of Rylands, it was argued that the storage of explosive during the manufacture of ammunition was not a non-natural use of the land. Okay. Sorry if my camera doesn't mention as well. Okay, but now you can see me and now you don't. Okay. We continue with the slide. Okay. No. Please back to the previous slides. Okay. The strict responsibility rule is interpreted different in each country. Okay. Okay. What the point that I want to state here is the strict responsibility rule is interpreted differently in Spain. Okay. For example, the burden of proof was transferred to the defendants in matters involving environmental contamination, such as fires, damage caused by particular gas or dust, and poisoning of waters is resulting in various sorts of harm. Okay. As a result, it is clear that the strict liability rule has been used to award damages in environmental pollution cases in certain other European countries. It has been used in a broader range of cases there. And in general, regulatory agencies or public authorities as well as their officers must bear the same culpability as private individuals. All right. Furthermore, courts are unlikely to impose a duty of care on a public authority or regulatory body if doing so would deter them from fulfilling their statutory obligations or be inconsistent with them. It is important to note that when a regulatory body or public authority breaches its statutory duties, claimants or plaintiffs typically or frequently seek to establish that an action for damages would arise. Okay. The defendant's statutory responsibility was charged absolutely by the judgment in Abdul Ghani bin Hamid, V. Abdul Nasir bin Abdul Jabbar, and Anwar, which is they stated that once it has been proven that a particular statutory duty has not been performed, it becomes actionable without having to prove any lack of care or diligence on the part of the person on whom the duty is imposed. All right. In the case of Rylands with Fletcher, there is no difference between the English and Malaysian positions. For example, in Hun Within Pacific Tin Consolidated Corporation, the court considered the rule in the context of Act of Court as an exception and stated that rainfall should not constitute an exemption without departing from English law. Meanwhile, in Hiap Levy Wang Mining Co., the private council stated, as Lord Simons pointed out in Rylands, the rule is intertwined with the law of nuisance, and responsibility can be proven under either heading in many circumstances. Meanwhile, in Canada, the two standards have caused confusion in Canada. As a result, a new rigorous responsibility regime, particularly in the case of pollution hazards. And last but not least, Malaysians could follow the same method to improve the rule if it is truly worth implementing. There should also be a requirement for third-party liability insurance along the same lines as Article 12 of the Convention on Civil Liability for damage resulting from activities dangerous to the environment, which why not include in our law that each party shall ensure that where appropriate, operators conducting on its territory be required to participate in a financial securitization or to have and maintain a financial guarantee up to enter a limit. Okay, I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Okay. For the defenses and in release and venture, so this is already been mentioned by certain countries, which is from first is England and Wales. Is also is being mentioned that an act of unknown third party will absolve the defendants of ability, which is mentioned in Perry v. Kendrick's Transport LTD in the requirement of Rylands with statements that it is strict liability and contributory negligence was most of the claims, and in the laws of laws reform, which is contributory negligence on the Act 1945 mentioned that courts instead operations damage has been taken into account on how much of the harms was contributed by the claimant. And not only for the England and Wales, also it is also been mentioned in the country of Scotland, using the concept of Rylands and Fletcher, being mentions of case that leads to the questions of the doctrine of strict liability for damage causes of by fire spread from defendant's land to claimant's land. And since also Rylands being applied in Scotland differently from the way it is being interpreted in England and Wales, so it was different way in the Scotland. And the ideas that Perrottier had to observe in higher degrees of diligence to prevent the injuries, which is, for example, neighbors was a heresy that ought to be interpreted, and also be mentioned by Mr. Syamim about the requirement that defendants or have to brought something onto in the land, and the defendants have to make non-natural uses of his land, and this also been mentioned in the thing that was something likely to do mischief if is escaped, and the thing uh, the line of the priority, the escape and causes of damage. Next. As for the times centuries, it also been practiced in the Australia, which is the principal was being killed off by the High Court of Australia in Brunei Port Authority, General John's penalty, and when the constructing this, the principal has been escaped distributing in the Hong Kong, China, where the courts are yet to be followed. The examples set and by the Australia and England and Wales. As for the remains, Rylands is an independent thought in both countries. As for the India, we mentioned that the rules of street liberty led by the Blackburn chain, we mentioned for the Rylands and Fletcher, have been put in effective for the passage of the time counter for the dangerous uses of the property in the industry that produce substance or waste detrimental to the public health, also being contribute with more society and involvement. And the exceptions provided within the Rylands rules has been restated by the Supreme Court of India, and being mentioned for the opportunity to the commercial enterprise to escape liberty, and MC Mehta for Union of India has been said that the court held that new rules to be laid to adoptability deal with the problems arising in a highly industry economy, and also be mentioned for the exceptions for the rules in the Rylands and Ventures for the storage authority, contributing litigants, acts of strangers of third party, and the concepts of the plaintiff. Next.
For the conclusion, the outcome of Rylands mean that judge will again impose strict liability of defendant who accumulated dangerous thing out there land without any need to prove negligence or wrongful intent. The decision support for bringing the law relating to private reservoir up to standard which the law relating to public, which contain similar statutory provision tends to appear for of private act of parliament passed in 1853 and 1864. That's all for me.
Okay, that's all from
Okay,
us.
that's all from us. Thank you.
Thank you.